Good evening. I'm John Miko, the Executive Director of the Union League Legacy Foundation, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's Jack Templeton Liberty Series. The Legacy Foundation is the nonprofit charity of the Union League of Philadelphia. Inspired by the United States Constitution and the history, the values, and the spirit of the Union League of Philadelphia, Legacy Foundation, our mission is to create more involved, more engaged citizen leaders. We do this through a host of programs like tonight's Liberty Series. Tonight's program will be hosted by Russ Roberts. Russ, many of you know from Econ Talk, and I'm thrilled that tonight's program will be broadcast on Econ Talk, which is a wonderful podcast. I suggest everyone check out Russ's YouTube page and Econ Talk. It will be next month. So you may hear Russ refer to Econ Talk for all of our Liberty Series program listeners and watchers. Russ will be replaying this, and please watch it again. I'm sure it'll be well worth it. We will have a Q&A section to tonight's program at the end, and you can ask questions through the Q&A function on the bottom of your Zoom. And tonight we also have CLE credit for all of our Pennsylvania lawyers, and the word is legacy. And I think Joe is going to share the link for you to email either now, maybe now and later in the program. And now it is my pleasure to introduce the chair of the Union League Legacy Foundation, who will introduce our program, Ms. Joan Carter. Joan.
Thank you, John. I am so happy to introduce our program tonight, Racism, Politics, and Economics in America. Our speaker is Jason Riley. Jason is a fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and he's a columnist for the Wall Street Journal. He also provides commentary for television and radio, and he is a frequent guest on my favorite show, which is the Journal Editorial Report on Fox. He's the author of 4 books, one of which will be published in May, and that one is entitled Maverick, a biography of Thomas Sowell, and I can't wait to read that, Jason. So leading our discussion tonight will be Russ Roberts. Russ, as John already told you, is an economist. He's a research fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution, and he's president of Shalem College in Jerusalem. He is perhaps best known for making very complicated, very sophisticated economic ideas intelligible and understandable to all of us regular folks. He is the host of Econ Talk podcast, and Jason and Russ, welcome.
Well, thank you, Joan. I want to thank you, John, and thank you to the Union League Legacy Foundation. Now we're going to get the official Econ Talk intro, which will air next month, and then we'll proceed with my conversation with Jason. Here we go. Today is April 15th, 2021, and my guest is journalist and author Jason Riley. He's a fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a columnist for the Wall Street Journal. His latest book coming out soon is Maverick, a biography of Thomas Sowell. I want to thank the Union League Legacy Foundation for partnering with us on this episode. This was part of a live webinar last month. Jason, welcome to Econ Talk.
Thank you.
Our topic for today is race, and with some politics and economics. Let's start with the Black experience today, this moment, 2021. Is the glass half full or half empty?
Well, I'm an optimist, Russ, so I kind of always see it as half full. The question is always, for me, whether people are taking advantage of the opportunities that exist today. I think there is no doubt that there are more such opportunities. But the question again is whether people are taking advantage of them, and whether our debates are about that versus other things that I consider more or less distractions from whether people are taking the initiative that they have today. And so I think that's largely where our debates are. And I'm a journalist. I'm part of the frequently disparage mainstream media, elite mainstream media, in fact. And I think part of the problem we have today is in how our coverage of these racial issues is taking place. And, part of that has to do with social media today and the ability of things to go viral, things that are rare to be presented as commonplace. And we can talk about, some examples of that, obviously. But by and large, I feel very blessed to live at a time in America when there have never been more opportunities for minorities, for Blacks and others. I think that's manifest the fact that immigrants are still currently, as we speak, on the border, trying to push their way into this country because they see opportunity here, they see a way to better themselves in their situation, and that continues. And so, again, the question is whether the people here are taking advantage of the opportunities that do exist.
There's obviously some serious barriers to taking advantage of those opportunities, and we'll talk about those. But you made a reference, an allusion, I thought, when you're talking about issues that are in the news and the mainstream media and social media. Right now, April 15th, we're in the middle of a lot of tragedy and turmoil and death related to the relationship between Black communities and the police. What are your thoughts on that issue in terms of where you think it stands and what needs to get done to make it better?
Well, I think that there is a preoccupation with within the media of breaking down these encounters between Blacks and the police by race without breaking down criminality by race. They want to talk about one without the other. And I think that presents a very distorted view of what's going on out there for the general public. And that gets to what I was referencing when I said that social media has played a role here in that distortion. So you have these encounters between the police and Blacks that gain more attention. But that does not necessarily mean that they're happening more often, Russ. Yet that is the impression being given through the coverage of these incidents. And so, just to give you some context here, the percentage of Black homicides in this country that involve police is quite small. The tragedy is the number of Black homicides in this country, and it's legitimately viewed as a tragedy. But the number that involves police as a percentage of those homicides is quite small. I mean, just a quick example, in Chicago, in 2019, there were 492 homicides. According to the Chicago Sun-Times, which has kept a tally of these, of those 492, 3 involve police. 3 out of 492. So we can talk about improving policing. We can talk about whether it should be easier to fire cops or whether they should not have the immunity that they're automatically granted in certain situations and so forth. Those are legitimate debates to have. Sure. But to me, they seem second order issues here. 97% of Black homicides in this country do not involve law enforcement. If we're worried about Black lives per se, if we want to reduce that body count, should our focus be on the 3% or 2% of Black homicides that involve cops, or the 98% that don't? And my concern is that the focus has been on the latter. And that is not only disturbing as a practical matter, it's disturbing to the extent that it could lead to less effective policing of these communities that most need effective policing. In other words, when you make police the targets, when you put the emphasis on them, when you start to scapegoat them for these outcomes, it has an impact on these communities. Police pull back. They are more reluctant to get out of their cars or take their time getting to the crime scene in response to a 9/11 call. And all that does is empower criminals in these communities who by and large prey on poor Black people. And we've seen this in city after city after city. This is not speculation. This is not anecdotal. It has been shown in empirical studies that when you scapegoat cops after these high profile incidences, they pull back. Crime increases, violent crime increases, and the most likely victims of those of that increase are poor Blacks.
Yeah, well, the governance of the police in America is a whole separate issue. I think, I think you're right. I think there's some evidence that they do pull back. The real puzzle then is who's in charge? Why wouldn't police chiefs say, do your job, but they don't? There's a certain autonomy to police in America that is.
Well, police are endogenous like any other group.
Yeah.
I mean, they're not automatons. They're going to respond to being scapegoated. And that's what we see happening.
Well, let's talk, you alluded to the role the media plays, obviously, in this perception, the 3 out of 492, the other 489, or was it? Yeah, 489. Obviously, one reason we don't spend much time on them is that they're usually not filmed. We don't have a lot of video footage of those tragic deaths, the homicides that are not at the hands of the police.
I don't think that's why we don't focus on them. I
Tell me
think we
why.
don't focus on them because it's not politically expedient to focus on them. Who benefits from focusing on them? When you look at the people who focus on police shootings, it's very obvious who benefits. If you're a civil rights organization who wants to keep race front and center and wants to pretend like it's still 1960 in America, then you focus on police violence. You focus on police shootings of Black people. You have no incentive to focus on non-police shootings of Black people, even if that is the overwhelming majority of police shootings. So this is a matter of incentives.
Shootings, yeah.
Yeah, I don't think, I think it's quite easily explained. If you're an activist, this is how you raise money. If you're a politician, this is how you drive Blacks to the polls. There are incentives in place to keep front and center what has been front and center in this situation involving police and Black suspects. And there's also an incentive to play down Black crime rates. I mean, the reality is that there is a legitimate reason why police are focused on these communities. This is where the 9/11 calls originate. There is no doubt about that. Police, Blacks call police more than any other group in America. It's a funny way of showing you don't trust cops. And the other thing that's going on here is that Black elites, whether they're civil rights leaders or Black politicians or Black activists, have been able to drive this debate in the media. The media turns to them to express the views of Black Americans writ large. And it was mentioned in the introduction that I just completed a biography of Thomas Sowell, a Black intellectual economist based at the Hoover Institution, Stanford University. And in researching the book on Sowell, I listened to any number of interviews he had done over the decades. And one question he was repeatedly asked, and I find myself repeatedly asked, was how does it feel as a Black person who's more conservative, right of center politically, to be so out of step with other Black people? And Sowell responded that by correcting the premise of the question. And he would say, you mean how does it feel to be out of step with Black elites? Black elites, he'd say, are no more representative of Black people than white elites are of white people. And so that is something to keep in mind when we have these debates. You know, in recent months and years, this whole defunding the police narrative has taken place, and the media repeatedly, you know, turns to these Black spokesmen, so-called. Oh yes, the police are the biggest problem in these communities. Policing is the big, not Black criminality. Policing is the biggest problem in these communities. We need to reimagine policing. We need to direct resources that are going into law enforcement. And this is the view of the Black community writ large. Well, I was always skeptical of this line of reasoning, not only because I've lived in these poor Black communities, I've worked in these poor Black, I've gone to school in these poor Black communities, and in my personal experience, this has never been the attitude that I've heard among Black people, that policing is the problem. So I was always skeptical, but there is reason to be skeptical of this. And let me just walk you through a little bit of the polling on actual Black people who live in these communities. And so in a Gallup poll released in 2020 showed that 81% of Black Americans said they wanted police presence in their neighborhood to remain the same or to increase. This is 2020. Another Gallup survey published in 2020 asked Black and Hispanic residents of low-income neighborhoods specifically about policing. And 59% of both Black and Hispanic respondents said that, quote, they would like the police to spend more time in their area than they currently do. A 2015 Gallup poll taken right after Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri, asked Black respondents about policing. A majority said that police treat them fairly, and more Blacks than whites said they wanted, quote, a greater police presence in their local community. And this is not a recent phenomenon, Russ. I can quote you polls going back to the 1990s about the importance of crime control among Black residents in poor Black communities. A poll in 1993 taken by Gallup found that 82% of Black respondents said the criminal justice system doesn't treat criminals harshly enough. 75% of Blacks wanted more cops on the street to combat crime. 68% said build more prisons so that longer sentences can be given. So this is going back 30 odd years, and we could go back even further. So we can talk about the defund the police movement. We can talk about what the activists are saying, but we cannot pretend that these folks are speaking on behalf of the Black rank and file. Based on the empirical data that we have, they are speaking for themselves. And too often the media has interpreted what they're saying as speaking on behalf of all Blacks. And that is very much part of the problem. It's part of what we saw in all these street protests over the summer about George Floyd. People really think there's some sort of epidemic going on out there of police targeting young Black men. The fact is that there is no empirical data to support that narrative. In New York City, where I'm based, it so happens that the police department has kept very detailed records of police shootings over the decades, going all the way back to the early 1970s. So in 1971, police in New York City shot 300 people. By 1991, 20 years later, that had fallen to 100 people. By 2019, it had fallen to 34 people. So police use of lethal force has declined by roughly 85% in the nation's largest city, with the nation's largest police force over the past half century. And New York is no outlier. You will find the same stats in Los Angeles and Chicago and Detroit and Cleveland and Oakland. You go down the line. Police use of lethal force has declined, especially among minorities. Yet we have groups out there claiming the exact opposite, that it's increasing, that it has become an epidemic. And I really think that this is largely a function of the media dropping the ball and refusing to put things in perspective and cite the sort of data I just cited.
Well, you're also suggesting, I love it, that the man who's just finished a biography of Thomas Sowell is lecturing The Economist about incentives, which is something I'm a big fan of thinking about. But it's interesting in this area. It's easy to forget. I'll be a little less mercenary than you are. Attention is what's valuable in today's. It's the coin that many people are eager to pocket, and I think the
yes,
attention,
controlling the narrative
yeah,
is more important than having the facts on your side. You'll have no dispute from me on that. It's unfortunate, but that's where we are. The facts can be completely at odds with the prevailing narrative, and it doesn't seem to matter.
Well, some people would argue that, no matter how few people are killed by reckless police or, negligent police or worse, malicious or racist police, it's too many people. For me, the problem is one of governance. Police unions are very powerful. There's very little. The chiefs of police in America have less control over their staff than I think would be healthy. But they like that too. They have an incentive for that to be the case.
We
as
can
well.
have that debate. We can have that discussion. It's an important discussion. Police reform is
Good
an
idea.
important discussion.
Yeah,
Should
good idea.
a police officer who's fired from one department be able to move into another jurisdiction and get a job at another police department without having that history of being followed? Follow him. Should these immunity laws that police have, are they legitimate? Those are all legitimate, very legitimate questions to have. And I have no doubt that there are racist cops out there, just like there are racists in any number of fields. I'm not someone who believes that racism has been vanquished from America. The question is, does racism explain the outcomes we see today in the criminal justice system? Or does behavior explain those outcomes? And that is the question. But the idea that we have that policing has become the centerpiece of a national discussion, to me, is completely at odds. It's with what's actually going on. And these young Black men in Chicago or Minneapolis or Oakland or New York may in fact leave the house every day, Russ, worried about getting shot, but not by police officers. Yet if you listen to the media, that is what you think would be the problem here.
Yeah, no, that's a tragedy all around in so many ways. And let's dig a little deeper into the behavior you're talking about and the issues that you think we ought to be spending more time on. You've spoken very eloquently and written eloquently on the lessons of history for the Black experience, in particular, what we should learn from the period after the Civil War up through the Civil Rights Act in the mid 1960s. That century, that 100 years, there were things to learn from that. In particular, there was quite a bit of improvement in the situation of Black people, despite Jim Crow, despite the handicaps. What do you learn from that?
Well, I learned that Jim Crow and the legacy of slavery are not, blanket explanations for Black outcomes today. There's no doubt that those events had a profound impact on the Black experience in this country. There's no doubt to me that discrimination and prejudice and bias can in fact play a role in a minority group's upward mobility. The question is, how big a role is it playing? How much of what is going on today does it explain? And I would argue that it explains quite little, given the amount of progress that was taking place when you had far more racial discrimination in America than you have today. A lot of people look at these Black crime rates And they cite poverty, Russ. Well, obviously, blacks are much poorer than whites on average. And so higher black crime rates make sense. These are desperate people, which might sound logical superficially until you realize that in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, black people were a lot poorer than they are today. And black crime rates were a lot lower than they are today. So this correlation that is just thrown out there between poverty and crime rates does not hold up to scrutiny. The poverty rate among black married couples has been in the single digits for more than a quarter century. Black people don't become less black after they get married. So is the poverty rate in America a function of racism or family formation? Is it a function of the fact that you see fewer married couples among blacks? But we don't talk about that. We jump right to the racial explanation or the racist explanation of these outcomes. And I think that's a mistake. And for some groups, they willfully ignore that reality because they have an entirely different agenda. And I just think it's incumbent upon the media, people in my profession, to challenge these folks when they cite racism as a blanket explanation, as an all-purpose explanation for racial disparities, whether it's in educational achievement or employment or income or any number of other measures. There are other explanations that I think are far more plausible in the 21st century than simply racism.
Go ahead. How would you explain some people would argue that it seems so long ago, I think it was the 80s when cocaine was very popular. White people took cocaine and they didn't pay such a high price for it. But when it was black people taking other drugs, they all went to jail for a long time. We cracked down on that in a very disproportionate way. I mean, I think drug policy in the United States has been had a terrible impact on the black community and white community, obviously, as well. But I think it's been disproportionately on the black community. Now, is that racist? Where's that coming from? I don't know. Would comment on that and also comment on what you think are the behavioral parts of this problem, and particularly the family issues that I know you've written about.
Well, in terms of the drug war, I think there's a little revisionist history going on here. You mentioned the 1980s and the crack epidemic of that period that led to legislation being passed that treated crack cocaine offenses more harshly than powder cocaine offenses. And of course,
that's what I meant. Thank you.
Blacks were more likely to use crack cocaine than powder cocaine, which was more prevalent among whites. What people leave out of that story is who led the fight for passing legislation that differentiated between sentencing for penalties for crack cocaine versus powder cocaine. It was the Congressional Black Caucus. People like Charlie Rangel and Major Owens, congressman from New York City, led the fight to install those differentials that are, in hindsight, all these decades later, suddenly viewed as racist. People conveniently forget who pushed for this because of what crack cocaine was doing to their communities. And you can go all the way back to Nelson Rockefeller and the Rockefeller drug laws in the early 1970s. Black leaders in Black communities led the push for the drug law war in the first place. Crime control has long been something that Black leaders have been preoccupied with, and rightly so, because violent crime has disproportionately harmed their community. So there's a little revisionism going on right there, and going back and rewriting what the motivations were and who was pushing what when, and why. But beyond that, just as a practical matter, I think there are very good arguments that some conservatives, libertarians, liberals make about the merits of the drug war. Whether it's doing any good, I think there are very good arguments on both sides of this effect as to whether it's been a bust.
So to speak.
But if your goal is to reduce mass incarceration, or B, reduce the racial disparities among our incarcerated population, among the prison population, going after the drug war is barking up the wrong tree. And here's why. Blacks are about 13% of the population. They're about 37% of the incarcerated population in this country. If you were to send home everyone who is incarcerated for a drug offense, that disparity, that racial disparity, would barely budge. Blacks would still be right about 37% of the incarcerated population. Nor would you address mass incarceration. America would still have the largest incarcerated population in the Western world if you sent home everyone who was in American prisons on drug offenses. So you would not address the mass incarceration problem by ending the drug war, nor would you address the racial disparity problem. And here's why. What is driving the Black incarceration rate are not drug offenses. They're violent offenses. Blacks commit violent crimes at 7 to 10 times the rate that other groups do. And according to the most recent figures I've seen, among the people who are incarcerated, violent criminals make up about 53% of the prison population. About 19% of the people in prison are there for property offenses. Drug offenses come in third at around 16%, or less than a third of the violent offenders in prison. So again, what is driving the Black incarceration rate? It's not drug offenses. It's violent offenses.
But some of those violent offenses are the result of turf wars over drug dealing.
There is some of that. There is some of that. But even among the drug offenders, we're not locking up people who have been caught with a dime bag because they were frisked by some cops for standing on a street corner. The people who get locked up in prison for drugs are dealers, Russ. They're traffickers.
Yeah.
That's who we're locking up. So again, there are very good reasons for ending the drug war, I would argue. But again, if your goal is to reduce that racial disparity in incarceration rates, ending the drug war is not going to get you there.
So what role does the family play in this, in your view?
Well, I think it plays a huge role. I mean, the correlation between violent crime in these communities, incarceration rates in these communities, and intact Black families is quite strong. You're an economist, and like me,
a negative correlation.
Yes, and like me, you're reluctant to try and make causal links here, but the correlation between when you had more intact Black families and what crime rates were at that time is quite revealing. I can give you a few figures on that. For instance, in 1960, Black men were murdered at a rate of 45 per 100,000. By 1990, that had climbed to 140 per 100,000, an increase of more than 200%. Was there more racism in 1990 than there was in 1960, Russ? I mean, does racism really explain what was going on? I mean, in 1960 in the South, you had police departments in places like Alabama that were like a third of them were members of the Klan, openly. I mean, the idea that racist policing today is responsible for the incarceration rates that we see today, or the arrest rates that we see today, is preposterous from a historical perspective. So what did you have going on back in 1960 or 1950 or 1930 and 40? You had more Black intact families. In fact, between 1890 and 1940, Black marriage rates, according to the census, were higher than white marriage rates in these countries, in the country. As late as the 1960s, 2 out of 3 Black children were being raised in a home with a mother and a father. Today, in some of these communities, upwards of 80% are not. And yes, I do think this has a lot to do with why these young men in Chicago are running around shooting each other. Yes, I think that does, in fact, play a role. What's also interesting about the first half of the 20th century is that you had this migration out of the South of Black people, these several large migrations out of the South, and even when people did not leave the South, they left rural areas and headed into cities. And we know historically that cities are much more violent places than rural areas in these countries. So you would have expected Black violent crime rates to increase in, say, the 1940s and the 1950s. In fact, the opposite happened. In the 1940s, homicide rates for Black men fell by more than 18%. And in the 1950s, they fell by even more, by more than 20%. At the same time when white homicide rates were basically flat in this country. And I think that's quite remarkable, given, again, the trends in terms of urban areas being much more violent than rural areas historically.
Well, let's talk about, I hope we get to the question of why you think the Black family has done so poorly in terms of family structure. But I want to ask you about education and a phrase that comes from economics, but I like your richer use of it, which is human capital. So one argument would be, I'm not going to call it racist on the part of teachers unions, but the inability to allow reform, the barriers to reform of the schooling system, I think have differentially punished Black communities at a time when education is increasingly important. So it's not, I'm not going to argue that schooling was always great and it's gotten worse. Probably it was pretty bad before and it's still bad now in poor neighborhoods in America, Black or white. But we live at a time where education is increasingly important. And my view is that too many young people in America are not given the tools they need to contribute and to earn and to hold their head up with dignity in the modern economy. And I'd like your take on that. What do you think?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, well, I'd start by saying human capital isn't my term, Russ. I mean, this is Gary Becker. This is Gary. This is the Chicago School.
But the reason I mention it is that a really bad economist thinks that human capital means how many years you sat at a desk in a school building.
Okay.
A good economist realizes that human capital has to be related to skill acquisition and other things. But you broaden it to include cultural factors that I think are neglected by economists.
Yeah, and not me, not only me. I mean, again, I would go back to those Chicago school economists like Gary Becker and like Tom Sowell, frankly, who use a definition of human capital that involves skills and behaviors and attitudes and culture. And the argument there is that if you get those things right, what we've seen is that minority groups, ethnic and racial minority groups, can overcome all kinds of discrimination or bias or structural this and that, or legacies of this or that in their history. And we see this time and time again. is played out not only here in the U.S. with certain ethnic groups, but around the world. Whether you're talking about the ethnic Chinese in Southeast Asia, whether you're talking about South Asians and East Africa, whether you're talking about Jews in any number of countries around the world down through history. What is between your ears is not something larger society can control. And so during, the times of Tsarist Russia, when 80 or 90% of the public was illiterate, most Jews had books in their homes. It didn't matter what the greater society's view of education was. They had a tradition. They had a culture that valued education, and it followed them wherever they went, whether it was into a country like Tsarist Russia where education was not valued, or whether they went anywhere else. And that has followed them down through history. And so if a group gets that right, that human capital factor right, it matters more than discrimination. It's not that discrimination or racism or prejudice doesn't matter. It's that human capital matters more. And so that is why I think some of us have focused so much on the development of that human capital, so that it doesn't matter who gets elected or who's in office and so forth. If you're a group that has valued skills and behaviors to advance, particularly in a free market economy, you're going to do just fine. If you look at who's hitting it out of the park right now in America, Asian Americans, you go, how much political clout do Asian Americans have in this country? Not much. And yet you see them overrepresented in the skilled professions. You see Harvard so panicked about them that they're trying to keep them out, the way they did Jews in the early part of the 20th century. I mean, that is what human capital gets you. And it's not just at the collegiate level. Here in New York City, where I am, even in the selective high schools, you see politicians trying to curb Asian enrollment in schools because these students are doing so well, and the politicians want more racial balance. And what's interesting about this is that if you look at a more detailed breakdown of the Asian students who are accepted at these more selective schools, at least here in New York, they come from disadvantaged backgrounds. Many of them come from some of the poorer zip codes in the outer boroughs, where their parents are solidly working class, but where they have cultural traits that prioritize, SAT test prep over $300 sneakers. That's cultural, Russ. That is not something that is the result of prejudice from society. And yet these kids are outperforming middle class and upper class Black and white kids to be admitted to these schools. And so again, that gets back to the primacy of human capital. And that is why I think so many of us focus on the importance of education as a way of economic advancement and upward mobility. And unfortunately, in this country, we have 85% or so of kids educated in public schools, which are controlled by and large by teachers' unions. And teachers' unions see public education as really more of a jobs program for adults. And so that explains the tenure rules, the last hired, first fired, the inability of a principal to put the most experienced kids in front of the most difficult kids to teach, and so forth. That explains a lot of what is going on in public education here in America, and that's why a lot of us work and advocate for more school choice and introducing more competition into public education. Because right now we're in a situation basically where we were with the post office, 30 years ago, before UPS and FedEx came along and put some competitive pressure on the post office to improve what it was doing.
Well, I remember in the documentary Waiting for Superman, how a really horrible teacher could just get shuttled to a different school system and get a new start, which is somewhat reminiscent of the union power you mentioned earlier with rogue police officers. Something there to think about. I want to mention something you mentioned before, though, which I think is very important. We're talking about human capital. as you pointed out, people risk their lives to come into the United States to be poor because they believe, these are immigrants, they believe that they will not stay poor,
Right.
that their children will not stay poor. And I know there's work that's been done recently by former past Econ Talk guest Ron Abramitsky with co-author Leah Bustan, and I forget the third co-author, I apologize. I think there's three, that the mobility of immigrants in the United States hasn't changed. It's still very high, despite these claims about that everybody in America is just, treading water, which I think is a misinterpretation of the data, as listeners get tired of me talking about sometimes. But I think that point about immigration is incredibly important. Now, it could be just they're deluded. They think this is the land where the streets are paved with gold, but in fact, it seems to be borne out by their actual experience. So I think that's a very important point.
I think you're absolutely right. And the thing about the immigration data is that it does undermine all the talk we hear on the left about stagnation and how there is no more upward mobility in America. That is not true when it comes to immigrants, which leads to the question of whether what I started out saying in my opening remarks, whether people are taking advantage of the opportunities that do exist. And then it comes down to why they are or are not taking advantage of the opportunities, not a question of whether those opportunities exist or not. And I think immigrants continue to show that those opportunities do exist. And these are humans, they act rationally, just like everyone else. And so if the opportunities weren't here, they wouldn't come. I mean, you know this. These immigrants are so plugged in to what is happening economically in America that there are economists who look at immigrant movements as leading economic indicators of where the economy is headed in the U.S. That's how tuned in these folks are. If somebody in Boston or Chicago or Seattle says to someone south of the border, don't come, there are no jobs here, don't come, they don't come. When there are recessions, we see fewer immigrants coming. And so I think they are acting very rationally. And my concern is that goes back to what Milton Friedman famously said, which is that you can't have open immigration and a large welfare state, because eventually it will turn into a welfare magnet. And we've seen that in various parts of Western Europe, where people migrate for the public benefits. And for many years, for many decades, we've had strong evidence in the US that is not why they come here. And we knew that. And we knew that. Well, yeah, they come here to work, and we know that because of largely because of where they go. I mean, for in the past 20 years or so, the fastest growing immigrant populations have been in states like Tennessee and Arkansas and the Carolinas and so forth. These are not places that are known for generous welfare benefits for us. These are places known for quite stingy welfare benefits. So, yet that is not where people have gone upon arriving in the U.S. So we know that they are coming for the jobs. But what I do fear is that as we continue to increase the size of the welfare state, and I think we made a big step in that direction with Obamacare, and we've continued down that road, particularly with the current administration. And what you see going on in the state level in these blue states, where they are actually, New York is having a debate right now of over how much money to give to illegal immigrants who are harmed by COVID. This is a state that is simultaneously having a debate on whether to become the highest tax state in the country. So we want to raise taxes on the most productive people in the state to give welfare benefits to people who are in the country illegally. That, to me, is a recipe for creating the welfare magnet situation that Milton Friedman warned us about. And so that is my concern. Even if you can argue right now that they're not coming for welfare benefits, as we continue to expand the size of the welfare state, that argument is going to be harder and harder to make.
to defend the left for a minute, which I always enjoy doing when I can. One might argue that, well, we don't know much about culture. So it's all well and good to say we need to improve the culture, say, of a particular ethnic community, or we could laud the culture of another one. We don't really have the levers, the policy levers to quote, fix that. So we're kind of stuck with that. And so to focus on that's a mistake. I think that's what a lot of people would argue. And so we focus on the stuff like the racism and the police enforcement and other issues that we think we can control. What's your answer to that?
Well, I don't know that we can control what we think we can control. And the question is what kind of goals we've set. There are some of us who believe that racism is part of human nature. We take a very tragic view of humanity. There are things that will forever be with us: war, inequality, racism, and so forth. And the goal is not to the goal is not to eradicate these things. I mean, we can hope to eradicate them, but realistically, what the goal should be to put in place institutions and processes that manage these situations, the rule of law, a military defense. I want world peace as much as I'm sure you do, Russ, but it's unlikely to happen. So the problem with a lot of these political solutions is that they're utopian, and they set up this utopian outcome as the goal, and say until we reach it, we can continue to tinker. And a lot of that tinkering, I think, has made matters a lot worse. Affirmative action would be, I think, a very good example of this. Well-intended policy to help more Blacks join the middle class, create the number of more Black professionals in this country, and so forth. And so, in places like higher education, we put in place systems where we lowered standards for Black applicants. But what happened? We ended up with more Black dropouts, Black kids who went into college wanting to be scientists or mathematicians, subsequently switching to easier majors because they were mismatched with schools. And we had this sort of natural experiment play out in many places. And then we learned that after the University of California system ended racial preferences in higher education, wow, Black graduation rates went up, including in the more difficult majors like math and science. So a policy that had been put in place to increase the ranks of the Black middle class had in practice resulted in fewer Black doctors and lawyers and architects and accountants and so forth. And so I think our public policymakers need to be a little more humble about what they do and don't know, and what they can and can't do. And largely this involves getting out of the way, which is why I wrote a book called Please Stop Helping Us.
Well, I think it's an incredibly important point that is often forgotten, that there are many problems in the world. Racism would be one of them. Crime, cruelty. It's a long list. The question isn't, are there things we wish were different? The question is, do we have tools available to make them better? And I often quote Thomas Sowell, and we'll segue to your biography of him now. He may have heard this from George Stigler. I don't know, maybe he'll tell me. That when given a policy solution, so-called solution, first of all, Sowell famously said, there are no solutions, only trade-offs, which I think is the essence, in many ways, the economic way of thinking. But he also would say, and then what? What comes next? Okay, it's well-intentioned. What are the consequences of it? And I think, what I think separates people like you from others isn't that you're cruel and heartless, Jason, but rather that you care about consequences and outcomes rather than intentions and motives. At least that's one attractive way that I defend my views when I'm called cruel and heartless. I always say we want the same thing. We disagree on how to get there. And I think your policies, say the minimum wage that someone advocates for, actually hurts people we're trying to help. So I think that's, I think that's many ways one of Sol's most important legacies. Do you agree? Intellectual legacy.
Absolutely. That is one of his legacies, and along with his belief that we should have no expectation of equal outcomes among groups to begin with. That this is a entirely unrealistic utopian goal and objective and starting point. And to say that because there are racial disparities in this area or that area is automatic evidence that something nefarious is amiss, is his starting point. He's saying, wait, why are you assuming that that we would have equal, particularly in a place like America, where you have people who have come here from cultures that vary geographically, climate-wise, in all kinds of ways, that they would all come to America. We'd send them to the PS-15 and sit them all next to each other in a classroom. And we would get equal scores on tests and they'd all get into Harvard. And if they don't, something's wrong. Harvard's discriminating. This is preposterous. This whole mindset that we assume that equal outcomes are the norm is not something borne out in history, not here in the US, not elsewhere, not today, not yesterday, not 500 years ago. Disparate outcomes are in fact the norm, and that the fact that we hold them up as commonplace and view any discrepancy from them as problematic or as a problem in and of itself is the wrong way to go about public policy making.
But what we haven't talked about, and we should, we've talked about the opportunities that many people in America have taken advantage of at different ethnic groups. And Blacks, of course, have improved greatly their economic well-being over the last 100 years. But they came from the legacy of slavery, unlike those immigration groups. Does that matter? A lot of people would argue that is the essential fact. They would argue that the United States was founded as a slave nation and that legacy has continued to burden Black communities. You're an exception. Thomas Sowell's an exception. You're just not relevant. Your ability to thrive, you're just you're a footnote. The overwhelming experience of Black people has been inevitably, irrevocably damaged by this legacy of slavery, and we should begin with reparations and a recognition that legacy is incredibly important. Do you agree?
Well, one problem I have with that argument is the progress being made by Blacks who lived much closer to the institution of slavery and Jim Crow. So, between 1940 and 1960, the Black poverty rate fell by 40 percentage points in this country, from 87% to 47%. And that was before any civil rights legislation of any significance had been passed. That was before affirmative action had been passed. That was before the Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act had been passed.
The Great Society.
The Great Society had been put in place. And so I look at the progress that was made under those circumstances. That was being made at a time when you could put a sign in your window that said, "We don't hire Black people." It was perfectly legal to do so. And so I look at that progress, and it wasn't just a reduction in poverty. If you look at the rate at which Blacks were increasing their levels of education, not only in absolute terms, but relative to white increases in schooling. If you look at income rates, if you look at home ownership rates. If you look at the level at which Blacks are entering the skilled professions, middle class professions, doctors, lawyers, teachers, social workers, accountants, and so forth, all of that was happening at a much faster rate among generations of Blacks that were much closer to the institution of slavery and Jim Crow. And so I find that that explanation wanting in that respect. And again, and that is not to say that slavery and Jim Crow have had no impact at all on the situation that Blacks face today. The question is, how much do they explain? I'm looking at right now a Bureau of Labor Statistics news release from January of this year. And it's about median weekly earnings in America. And it says Blacks and Hispanics are lower than whites in their earnings, but whites are lower than Asians. And Hispanics are lower than Blacks. And this always complicates the sort of facile explanation that the left presents in using racism as an all-purpose explanation for inequality. If that is true, how is it that Hispanics, who have no history of slavery in America, are earning less than Black people are? How is it that Asians, who have experienced tremendous discrimination at the hands of white people, you had eras when there were limits to what schools they could go to, what jobs Asians could have in this country. Asians were not allowed to own property in certain states. During World War II, they were rounded up and interned. They significantly out-earned white people in this country and have for decades. How is this possible under the explanation that racism and racial prejudice and racial discrimination explains all? And you come across this time and time again when Asians are included in the equation, whether you're talking about, bank loans or the number of Blacks that are pushed out of employment during recessions. People always do Black-white comparisons. Oh, Blacks are denied for loans at higher rates than whites. Well, whites are denied at higher rates than Asians. If racism is the reason, then you're left with this absurd view that white bankers are discriminating against white loan applicants in favor of Asians. The alternative is that other things are a factor here that we're not talking about because we stopped the discussion after a consideration of racism and the role that it plays. And again, I think that is doing a disservice not only to the national debate about these issues, but a disservice to what the Black underclass needs to be focused on in order to advance. And right now, the thinking is that all it should really be focused on is obliterating racism in America. And if it could just do that, everything would be hunky-dory. And I see no evidence that that would be the case.
So let's close with where we started. I think you said, it seems it was a long time ago, Jason. I think you described yourself as an optimist.
Yes.
Race relations, the role of race in the national discussion right now is at a pretty depressing point for me. Yeah. I'm white, you're Black. So I don't know how you feel about it, but the way that people talk about race right now, we're so far away from Martin Luther King's vision of a person being judged by the content of their character, identity politics, race as a overwhelming determinant of who you are, and nothing else has become the norm.
Oh yeah.
White people, and maybe some Black people, are afraid to talk about it because they're afraid they're going to be canceled. Give me a little optimism going forward. Give me something to take home as a little cheerful.
Oh, well, first, I do share your pessimism on this front. We've turned King's ideas on their head. Judge me by the content of my character, not the color of my skin. Don't focus on my race. Now we're to Black Lives Matter. That is King in reverse. And if you refuse to say that Black Lives Matter, we have a problem with you. If you say all lives matter, we have a problem with you. So that is anti-King, and that's where we are right now. And I am very disturbed about that. And the reason why, Russ, is that that element has always been out there. I've taken some comfort in that it was confined to academia.
That's true.
It was, these were silly debates happening in seminars and discussions between intellectuals and publications nobody else read for decades. But now they've spilled over into the larger society. They're part of our everyday language when we talk about institutional racism and unconscious bias and we're doing diversity training at schools and critical race theory, and it's quite disturbing. This stuff is being taught to elementary school children, and critical race theory is quite radical. This is a view that white people cause all Black problems, and those Black problems are the responsibility of white people to solve. It asks nothing of Blacks, and I find that quite disturbing. And why I'm optimistic, however, is that I think that on balance, the American people will only put up with this nonsense for so long before they will eventually push back against it and call it out. And I think we see that happening here and there, but I think that will be the case. That the left and the progressives are really pushing things here, and I think they'll only be able to obscure the reality. I mean, when you have statistics like the one I mentioned in Chicago, 492 homicides, 3 involving police. Gee, let's have a discussion about police. How long can that view hold before people say this is a sideshow? This is a second order problem. We need to focus on the real problems, and that's why I'm optimistic. I guess I have this enduring belief in the common sense of the American people, and that it will prevail in the long run, even if I'm a little pessimistic in the short run.
My guest today has been Jason Riley. Jason, thanks for being part of Econ Talk.
Thank you.
And now we're going to turn it over to John Miko for some questions from our audience, and I'm going to step back. I just want to thank you again, Jason. That was really great. We'll talk when that episode comes out.
Okay.
Go ahead, John.
Thank you, Russ. Thank you so much. What a great interview. We have a ton of questions. We'll probably only get to a few of them for 2 reasons. One, like every great interviewer, most of them were covered in this program, and that's fantastic. But there are a few I do want to get to in the short time that we have. And one of them, Jason, is about, I have 3 or 4 questions about Thomas Sowell, but I'm just going to ask you the easy question. Why is Sowell important? Why does he matter today?
I think the first reason I think Sowell matters today, and the reason I wrote the biography, and in addition to the biography, I narrated a documentary film about Thomas Sowell that's available on YouTube and Amazon and some other outlets. And I was happy to do so because I think his work continues to resonate to discussions we're having today. I think he's still very much relevant. But the first reason is because of the type of intellectual Sowell is. He's someone who is pursuing the truth, and getting to the truth is what matters most to him. even if the truth turns out to be unpopular or politically incorrect. That is not a concern of his. That is not going to affect his scholarship. And you might think, well, isn't that the way all intellectuals and scholars behave? But it isn't, and that's saying something about where we are today. There are any number of intellectuals and scholars, particularly writing in the area of race and culture, inequality, that bend things to accommodate the mood of the country, who are worried about being canceled or considered unpopular, not without justification. I mean, we were in an environment where it could affect your professional career if you say certain things, and we have endless examples of that happening. But Sowell is someone who has spent his scholarly career not concerned about that sort of thing. He tells it like it is, and that sort of honesty, that rigorous empiricism, following the facts where they lead, reporting the results, no matter how unpopular or politically incorrect, is something that I think has distinguished his scholarship and something that he will be remembered for. So that's how I would answer that.
Well, you were kind enough to send me an advance of that book, and we're going to send out a link so that people can purchase it after the program. It's really wonderful. It's a wonderful piece, a wonderful book. Question: the Oregon Department of Education now has teacher training that claims that white supremacy is inherent in making math students find the right answers. Can you comment on this? What is your reaction?
It's absurd. Obviously, it's absurd. But that's that's where we are. That's part of the what makes me pessimistic in the short run about what we have to go through. It's math is racist. Punctuality is racist. Objectivity is racist. It's absurd. And it's not doing lagging groups any good. Is the bottom line. A lot of these people want to water down standards for these lagging groups, and they think they're doing these groups a favor, but they're not. You can eliminate the SAT, but all the SAT is a measure of where kids are academically. And if you eliminate the test, it doesn't eliminate where they are academically. You just obscure where they are academically, and it's going to show up somewhere else in their life. Maybe when they're applying to graduate school or that first job, or they're not getting the promotion, but it will rear its head. And so, wherever these kids are and wherever they want to go, they need to get to from where they currently stand, which means we need to know where they currently stand. And to say, stop testing will not end these disparities. You only obscure those disparities. So I think a lot of these folks on the left that are pushing for watered down standards or no standards have really given up on these kids. And that's a shame. They've decided these kids will never measure up, so we have to stop measuring them. And I think that's giving up on these kids, because we know, we were talking earlier about school choice and education. There are schools, academic models out there that are geared toward serving these communities and are doing a phenomenal job of that. You have kids in charter school networks these are schools full of kids that are 80, 90% free and reduced lunch, 80 and 90% Black and Hispanic, outperforming the liliest white suburbs on standardized testing. We know how to educate these kids, and it's about scaling up that model to reach more of these kids, not about eliminating the tests that show us where these kids are.
There's a couple of questions about Daniel Patrick Moynihan's 1965 report. And I think there was a passing reference to it in your discussion with Russ.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I'm just going to ask this question. What is it and what was its impact?
Well, Moynihan was working for the Labor Department at the time. This is before he became a U.S. Senator from New York. This is in the 1960s under Lyndon Johnson. And he published this report noting, the Black family was in trouble. The trend lines were not good. You had a lot of single parent homes, single moms in particular. And he said, this is not going to end well if this trend continues. And he was pilloried for this. He was just he was called a racist. He was called blaming the victim. And the legacy of that experience is quite important, because what it ended up doing was the treatment of Moynihan turned off a lot of social scientists to talking about these issues among Blacks in particular. The thinking became, I am not going to go in for the treatment that Moynihan received by raising these issues, regardless of the merits of what Moynihan was saying. This could be a career ender for me. I don't want to be called names. And so a lot of social scientists simply didn't talk about this for decades. And it became the huge elephant in the room that family formation, we couldn't talk about that. We couldn't talk about Black culture and the role that it was playing in income inequality in America and social inequality in America. It was just verboten. And only recently have scholars in the past decade or so began to go back to saying, we really can't ignore this huge elephant in the room here. We need to talk about these things. And you've had scholars at Harvard like Orlando Patterson, William Julius Wilson, who was affiliated with the University of Chicago for many years, saying, we kind of need to talk about this as a factor. And the reluctance to do so, however, dates unfortunately all the way back to Daniel Patrick Moynihan and that report in the 1960s and how it was received.
Well, Jason, thank you for being here and talking to us about these things. We are grateful to have you with us. Russ, thank you for another outstanding interview, as always. I'll just ask Russ one question. You're going to be going to Israel very soon, correct? I hope and trust that Econ Talk will continue.
It will. Now, I started full-time at Shalem College in Jerusalem on March 1st. We're taping this on April 15th. We have still managed to get Econ Talk out every week. We'll see. My head may explode, but the plan is, that would be bad for both my presidency and my podcast. But I'm optimistic that I can continue to do both. I'll still be affiliated with the Hoover Institution, so I hope to do both. But it's an exciting opportunity. I appreciate your concern about my sideline and my what do we call it? My second job.
Well, Russ, good luck to you. Jason, thank you so much. I hope that we'll have you in person at the Union League sometime soon.
Sure.
And again, both of you, thank you very much for your time and for your goodwill, your honesty, and your intelligence. My thanks.
Thank
you, John.
So that's our Liberty Series for tonight. We have several upcoming programs next week. We have Charlie Zahm on April 21st, who will be singing his Civil War songs. And for those of you who know Charlie, he's a wonderful entertainer, and I hope you'll join Charlie for that. And on May 13th, we have Library Hour with Cordelia Biddle and Jackson. So it's another bank war that we're going to be talking about. And May 17th, The Future with COVID-19 with Susan Bailey, who's the president of the American Medical Association, and our own Union League member, Stephen Klasko, the CEO and president of Jefferson University and Jefferson Health. So we hope you'll join us for those. In between, we have this thing we've been doing for 75 years, this civic education program called Good Citizen Day. And this year it'll be Good Citizen Days. So we look forward to seeing you on the 21st with Charlie Zahm. Thank you and have a great night.